Hoi anō, anei e whai ake nei ko te kai kōrero tuarua I tēnei ahiahi. A leading advocate for the rights of women and children and also a strong public voice in the campaign to understand and indeed prevent family violence. She's based in Rotorua, has a long and distinguished history of public service, having served as the CEO of the West Auckland Hospice and rose to national prominence as the outspoken former CEO of Women's Refuge. Please welcome Mihipeka Raukawa Tait.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Minister, tēnā koe, Dr. Kiki, Debbie, tēnā kōrua. It's been a pleasure to be here today. I am going to ask Awerangi Tamihere to give our presentation today, but can I just take 2 minutes, please, just to talk to you about the required leadership that we will have to see demonstrated if we are going to make the quantum leap in terms of whānau development and transforming our whānau lives. When the Prime Minister, when Jacinda Ardern was campaigning to get elected, she talked about kindness. She talked about kindness and compassion. And she was poo-hooed by our media. You'll recall that. When she got elected and she talked about well-being and she talked about the reduction of child poverty, there were snide remarks said then. There was no poo-hooing of our Prime Minister last week. There were no snide remarks. That is the fearless leadership that we will require of all of us in this room and those who are not in this room to make the quantum leap for our families that we have to make to transform their lives, to remove that embedded despair that I heard someone refer to this morning that has been there for decades. And Awerangi is now going to outlay to you or to give you the chronology of events over the decades that have embedded the despair in our people that needs to be removed. For those, and I heard the ministers say this morning, Minister Mahuta say this morning, that if it's too hard to try, and I'm saying these days, if you believe it's too hard, then get out of the way for those who can do it. Kia ora tātou.
E te meneta, tēnā koe, o tira, tēnei hoki te mihi atu ki a koutou, nā mihi matakuikui ki a koutou. It's very timely that we're here today for this Whānau Development Summit. The year is 2019. This is a sunset year of another decade in the 21st century. It beholds on us before we leave today to think very carefully about the challenges and what we should do differently as we enter into a new decade, a sunrise decade of yet another part of the 21st century. This morning we heard from Minister Mahuta, who talked about the role that Te Puia played in developing things before us in order to enable the way for whānau ora. Not only that, in a number of workshops today, we have heard from people talking about the 5-year context, the 10-year context, the 15-year context, the 20-year context, the 25-year context for generational change. But it beholds us to understand that there are very stark disparities still facing us. But in order to understand that, 2019, 2020 is very significant. And as a result, I thought about this, changed some of my slides, and decided, hold on a minute, let's look back 100 years. Let's look back to 1920s, which I'm going to share with you now. So we have to look back, in other words, in order to look forward. The 1920s. What happened then? It was Young Māori Party. Api Ranangata, Maui Pomare, James Carroll, Te Rangi Hiroa, just to name a few. It was the establishment of the Rātana Church. It was a time where the improvement of Māori health and welfare were at the forefront. And that was 100 years ago, next year. Let's carry on and talk about the 1940s to the 1960s. And I want to pay tribute here to Erewera Turakatani, because for him, Māori social and economic solutions were about bonding the government to social and economic outcomes for Māori. But still today, we're talking about the exact same thing. As a result of his passion in this area, we saw the Māori Social and Economic Act in 1945, which was watered down slightly, which I'll talk about in a minute, to the Māori Community Development Act in 1963. And also in that period, though, we saw some significant Māori movements established, such as the Māori Women's Welfare League, and as a result of the Māori Community Development Act, we saw the New Zealand Māori Council also established in 1963. These are important hallmarks that underpin the issues that we are here discussing today. The 1970s saw the socialisation, the beginning of many Māori models of well-being within our mainstream agencies. Te Whare Tapawhā was first brought about in the mainstream situation in 1971. That began to open the conversations and discussions of other Māori models that we needed to look at and within a mainstream setting. The early 1970s to 1980s. Example of this is Te Huia Rangatahi, who took charge to understanding that there was Māori must own the determination if we are to be successful in the future. Māori students were on the uprise in the university campuses. They were an example of many emerging positive Māori movements that started to come into play. The 1980s to the 1990s. 1983, Mātua Whāngai. 1988, Puao Te Atatu. 1990, Kāwatia. 1986 to 1990, the devolution program to iwi, mana and Maxis programs. Mid-1990s, as was talked about earlier in a workshop with the Green and White paper, the establishment of Māori providers. In this period, 1980s to 1990s, there was establishment of Māori policies and the operationalising of Māori policies. Late 1990s to 2000s, treaty settlements, closing the gaps policy. 2010 to the present, the whānau order policy, children in poverty, and the wellbeing policy. What does this mean for us now? Because no longer do I want my great-great-grandchildren 100 years later to continue to be rolling off policies, and still we do not see a change in the disparities, or can we evidence the outcomes of change that are positive for Māori. It is urgent, it must be dealt with now, and we must look at things very differently to how we have done so far. So what are the themes that have come out of this whole 100 years? Two things for us here that are also brought up in the Whānau Order Review and acknowledged there. The responsiveness of mainstream services to the needs of Māori. The whānau-centred approaches that you're all on a journey on in some way doing to meet the needs of our people. That's one part. But one of the things we must understand, are we continuing to support our Māori providers who have been in place for so long to be able to own those provider roles and do that for themselves? Where are we seeing the number of Māori take responsibility for their own delivery to their own people as opposed to other agencies? How are we continuing to ensure that we put at the forefront whānau-centric models and approaches in your government agencies? That's one part that's come out of the 100 years that has been looked at. The second one, as we've heard before from Helen, is Māori enabling whānau to achieve their aspirations. It's about responding to the urgency to ensure outcomes and sustained outcomes for whānau. And as you've heard earlier, that is about the Whānau Order Commissioning for Outcomes model. I'm going to deep dive a little bit into those two now. Whānau-centred approaches by government agencies. Let's look at it this way. It starts from a premise that it's top-down. What are the needs? What are the issues facing our whānau? What are the tightly designed services and service specifications we need to develop to put those in place, and the policy that underpins those? What are the providers that government agencies must work with whānau alongside them to fix the problem? Now the question here is to fix the problem. Mainstream providers and Māori providers. Now the important thing here is this is what's underpinned the whole public sector business methodology for years and years and years. So when you do it the same way you'll get the same outcome. But let's be very honest, that's what this model is about. There is a place for this model, as in the Whānau Order Review said, but it's about whānau-centred approaches within a mainstream government organisation. Commissioning for outcomes model. That starts, as we know, from a very different place. What are the aspirations for whānau? How do we work with whānau first on the ground? What are the outcomes they want to achieve? How do providers on the ground become agile and wrap around them to achieve their outcomes first? How then do we report on those outcomes and to share with everyone else on our data how those outcomes are achieved? That is the difference in a commissioning for outcomes model. But what I want to acknowledge here is Te Puni Kōkiri, because before the commissioning agencies came in place, they actually undertook the thought leadership first to understand, while we have a public sector model, which is business as usual from a top down, if we're really to make a difference and do things in a different way for outcomes for Māori, there must be a different model. The reality is, it's very hard, as some people have mentioned already in the workshops today, to shift that model overnight. That's the reality of the beast of the government machinery. However, TPK put themselves on the line by understanding it has a thought leadership role for the public sector in designing and co-designing with other Māori agencies a commissioning for outcomes model that starts with whānau first and works up. It has a very different procurement policy. It has a very different style of operating. Now, is either one right or wrong? No. There's a place for both. But what I'm here to share with you is a little bit about what underpins this particular model here. I need to share with you too, I'm not going to talk today about our commissioning agency. I have put in the slide deck for you all the slides about what it does, how it operates and so forth, so you have that there. And there's multiple publications about what the agency does. But what I want to acknowledge here today is that this commissioning for outcomes model that's been talked about by all three commissioning agencies today is actually the thought leader for commissioning for outcomes for vulnerable communities on behalf of the public sector. By understanding it's prototyping a very different way of doing business to the usual government machinery. And the way it is doing that is through whānau ora. I'm going to leave that out for now and carry on. But rather than leave it there, this is a challenge we have today. If we're going to sit here and look at 2020, we have to leave this room doing things quite differently. In some respects, that means a lot more thinking in your own organisations about how do you become more whānau-centred, how do you work alongside a lot more with your Māori providers who know their communities best. But then there's this whole commissioning for outcomes. How does that fit? How does that fit into my organisation? So we have to come across what's called the sweet spot. Because the sweet spot, as we've heard for the last 100 years, there's a place for Māori by Māori that's aspirational based. And there's also a place to deal with the needs and the issues that are facing our organisations by government agencies. But if we're talking about a whānau development summit, it's about both. It's not about one and it's not about the other. So what is the sweet spot I'm interested in where we can work side by side as we go forward? One, as I've heard it from a number of conversations today, is a mutual understanding of the common shared agenda that we all want to address, ensuring outcomes for Māori. That could be, we have one government agency here today who is working with us at the moment and looking at putting their Māori indicators team into our outcomes-based Māori research team for the next few months. So that's an example of just understanding the capability and the thinking so that you're able to get some capacity and understanding of that. But not only that, there's something more significant here. But it comes across to your chief executives and your senior executives to be able to deal with this. That you are able to work alongside commissioning agencies, that you are able to co-invest with commissioning agencies. But that means, rather than try and put this aspirational outcomes model in place in your own paradigm of how the needs-based approach down, it requires your chief executives and senior management to prototype and keep separately under strategic senior sponsorship a different approach of outcomes and work alongside commissioning agencies. If you do that, you're able to take away the current business methodologies of your current procurement policies, risk policies, and look at it differently. There is a place for both. It's never about one or the other. The reality is, as we look forward to working together, it is about collaboration. It means constantly looking up and out of your own area See who else is there, who's thinking with you, talking the same language, and is in a like-minded space. Because there's a multiple round of of expertise here today that can share on this. So for us, those are the 2 points that I want to leave. But I'm also going to leave you one thing more. And this is called the 2020 Whānau Order Formula. I'm going to leave something for us to all think about if we're going to move forward. And that is, there's something about whānau order that has the X factor, and it's about how we all together come together for a common shared agenda for outcomes that achieve what we want to aspire to for Māori. First thing, it's called WC plus WOC equals WO to the power of 10. Who knows what that is? Whānau-centred policy, such as our government agencies I've talked about today, and having more of a focus on whānau-centred policy, together with the whānau order commissioning model, equals what? Whānau tino ora. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.